Thank you for joining us again for this next segment concerning the subject of grief. And in this particular topic, we want to talk about complicated grief. What causes grief to be complicated? Grieving is a process. Again, understanding grief from the very beginning to realize that grief is about loss, not about death so much, but death brings loss, so therefore death causes grief. But with that, grief is about loss, and loss is an event that causes things to be forever different. And one of the things that complicates grief, and we'll come up with this as we go through the list of things, but one of them is it not only causes things to be forever different, but it causes people to be forever different, and we'll explain that as we go on. We're going to use the concept of normal grief, but I think we need to explain that too. I mean, if you're talking complicated grief, you need to have something to compare it to. Well, normal grief doesn't necessarily mean that a person is grieving the same way as everybody else. No, there is no set pattern. I've often said the idea that if a person is not hurting themselves or someone else, whatever they find in their grieving process that gives them comfort, that gives them strength, that helps them get through it, then that's okay. But now again, as long as they're not hurting themselves or someone else. So in an essence then, your grief might be very different from someone else. That is, the way you respond to and react to it might be very different from someone else. And yet could be very normal for you. And I suppose that's the best way we would define normal grief. What's normal for you? What helps you get through it? But again, we're going to see in a few moments here how grief can be complicated by different circumstances. And that's basically what we're going to talk about is causes of complicated grief. What makes it different? But with the grieving process, again, we want to realize that it's about loss. And loss, again, is something that causes life to change. And the grieving process, and that's what makes it so much more difficult, because the grieving process is a matter of getting used to the changes. It's a matter of realizing, what makes it complicated is that, okay, I might be doing good today, but suddenly tomorrow I run into something that we once used to do, but now it's so totally different that I feel like I'm going back to square one, and it's like hitting me all over again. And with these different feelings of grief. Now that's another thing we have noted in some of our other segments on grief, but in order to lay the foundation this time, we have to do it again. Okay, there are many different feelings coming with grief, and I've often said I do not like the term grief cycle or stages of grief. The reason I don't like that is it gives us a misconception. It gives us the idea that it should be certain ways, and, well, okay, the word cycle of grief. Then these feelings and emotions, and let's list some of them. Different psychologists have focused on different things. And really all they've done is watch individuals going through the grieving process and label certain things that they're going through. For instance, the concept of denial or shock. The idea of this isn't really happening. I'm going to wake up from this and it's all going to be gone and all of this. And we would like to suggest it's not real. And sometimes that shock can be so extensive that I've had individuals tell me they didn't remember anything that happened through the whole week of the funeral and so forth when they lost a loved one. And so with that, it's a very difficult time. But what's also interesting, it's a stage. Some like to say it that way. But the thought is, well, okay, if I get through that first week and that first couple of days and I accept the idea that it's really happened, then I'll never have that problem again. But there are other times, let's say during holidays, and we're going to try to share a particular segment on grief during the holidays. But during the holidays, suddenly we're reminded all over again, and it's like going back to stage one. Oh, he's got to be here. She's got to be here for Christmas Day and all this and so forth. And we're going back to that all over again. So the stages would suggest, well, okay, I'm done with stage one, so now I'm going to be stage 2, 3, 4, and it doesn't necessarily happen that way. And the same concept with a cycle. It will happen this way, but then this way be next, but suddenly we find that many of these different feelings, again, shock and denial, anger, guilt, depression, loneliness, all of these things are different feelings. And the word grief is rather new, actually. I mean, it's old for us to understand, to realize when it came about, but it's rather new when it comes to dealing with all of these different emotions. And it's very important to label it grief. The reason for that is when I feel these other emotions, if I can label it grief, then I know why I'm feeling angry, why I'm feeling guilty. I know why I'm feeling depressed. I know why these feelings are happening there. So it's not a case of, okay, there's something wrong with me. And that's one of the reasons we want to share with you an understanding of grief, because so many people go through these things and think that there's something wrong with me. I don't know how many times people have told me, well, you're going to think I'm crazy, and they'll start telling me what they're going through, what they're experiencing, and the message is, no, you're not crazy at all. This is often what happens in the grieving process. And that's why we want to talk about this complicated grief, because sometimes when there are different causes for the grief, causes that cause complication, then the person thinks, well, this isn't normal. I felt this way one time ago when I had a loss and so forth, but now it's different. Well, that's why we want to point out the fact that no, there's not necessarily something wrong with you. It's not necessarily that you're off balance emotionally, but it's like there are different things that causes grief to be different. Indeed, grieving over the loss of one person as compared to another person. Again, you have to understand the relationship and all of that. And that's one of the things that deals with the subject of complicated grief. What was the relationship and all of this? And we'll get into that as we start going over these things. But that's what we want to point out. And again, so when we're talking about normal grief, it's not a case that everybody works in a certain way and that's normal. No, everybody's different. I cannot say to you, and I think I've heard that this is one of the most disturbing statements that I've ever heard from someone talking to another individual about grief, and that is, oh, I understand what you're going through. And the response is, you can't understand what I'm going through. You have no idea what I'm going through. And so I caution anybody who is working with a grieving person, don't use that statement, because you can't understand. Even if you've been there yourself, you can't fully understand what they're going through. And to do that is almost an insult, almost to tell them, you don't know what I'm facing. You don't know what I'm feeling. And so with that, that's a statement that you definitely rule out. I don't understand, even if I've been there. But if you want to be helpful, I would like to try to understand if you want to share it with me. If you want to tell me what it is that you're feeling, if you want to talk about your feelings, I want to be here to listen so that maybe I can grasp a little bit of an understanding. But I got to tell you, I don't understand what you're going through. And with that, I've never been there. Now, if you want to make a comparison, you might, but I strongly caution against this. If you want to make a comparison, you might share one of your stories of your grief experience, but you need to clarify something. But mine's not the same as yours, so I'm not really sure that I understand what you're going through. It can be helpful to the individual to understand that you're going through something or you've been through something, and that might be helpful. But again, don't try to suggest you know everything about what they're facing. That is a more grief, can I say? More grief, because one of the problems of grief, I go through the grief by myself. Okay, don't get me wrong. One of the things that you need to do to help a person going through grief is to journey with them. Not instruct them, not tell them you should. No, but journey with them. Being willing to listen to what they've got to say. Let them share what they're really feeling, because those feelings are inside, and one of the best ways to deal with grief is to get them out, and they need someone to listen to them. And that's the most important part, being an active listener, being willing to hear what they're saying, and maybe even asking questions that will help them share a little bit more about what they're saying. That's what you do with a grieving person if you want to help them. Journey with them. Let them share with you. Let them talk to you. Well, with this in mind, then, we want to look at what causes complicated grief. There are many different causes. Let me speak of trauma. Now, first of all, we want to look at the idea if the death is by way of a traumatic experience. Let's say we lost a loved one, or whatever we've lost is by way of a traumatic experience. Now, remember we said it's about loss. So if this traumatic experience maybe lost my health, maybe this traumatic experience, a person lost an arm or a leg, and life is now forever different for them. And that trauma causes complications. Now, in order for us to understand why that causes complications, we need to understand what trauma is. Okay? So let's take a moment to talk about trauma. Trauma is the extreme form of stress. Now, stress, I don't like the dictionary's definition, so I'll give you my definition. Well, let me share the dictionary's definition. It's the body's reaction to a threat and/or challenge. I don't like that, because anything that happens to the body starts with the brain. And stress affects the chemical flow of the brain. And then the brain sends signals to the body, and the body reacts. So I'm going to say it's the brain's reaction to a perceived threat and or challenge. Now, I like to put the word perceived in there because if I'm going to understand stress, if I'm going to understand somebody else's stress, I need to get to the place where I perceive what the stress is, in the sense of what you perceive to be stress might not be stressful to me. One of the things that I deal with is breaking down on the highway. It's very stressful to me. When I go long distances, I like to rent a new car. And even a new car will break down, but wait a minute, I don't have to worry about it because it's somebody else's car. And all I've got to do is call this number and somebody takes over from there and all of this. And so with that then, I deal with the stress of breaking down on the highway. If I hear a noise in my car that shouldn't be there, I can break out in a sweat from head to foot just like that. And that's one of the reactions to stress. Well, with this in mind, then, I've got truck drivers out there that hear a noise in the car, they'll turn the radio up. Okay? There's people that deal with that in a very positive way, and it's not stressful to them. And so I've got to say, if we're going to understand stress, we've got to understand how the person perceives the stressful thing. So it's the brain's reaction that sends the signals to the body to a perceived threat and/or challenge. Now, if I perceive it as a challenge, it's going to be less stressful than as I perceive it as a threat to life, a threat to dismemberment, and so forth. How I perceive it is going to make a difference in the stress. Now, I said trauma. We're really looking at trauma now. I said trauma is the extreme form of stress. Now, let's look at what stress is. Stress is something you see as a threat or challenge. You deal with it, and then you rebuild. For instance, a car's coming at me down the highway. Okay? I see it, I feel a threat, this is dangerous, and I pull the wheel of my car over to pull the car over to the side, and I just dealt with it. I saw the threat. I steered the car away. I dealt with it. And then you sit there for a moment and you feel so weak. Why? Because everything in your body geared up for a crash. Everything geared up for your first perception. And so now you've dealt with it, and so you sit there and you rebuild, your strength comes back, and so forth. Well, trauma loses that third part. They see it, they deal with it, and they keep on going. Let's look at post-traumatic stress disorder from the concept of the military. Okay, and it's not just military, but with everyone. When you deal with something and you see it as a threat, you deal with it, but you do not rebuild afterwards. Okay, and that's what happens in the military. They deal with situations in combat. They lose their friends, or maybe they have just taken a life for their first time in their lives. And in all of this, they are part of a system. They are part of a program. They have a goal. They work as a team, and so they've got the team support, the goal in mind, and they just keep on going and keep on going. Well, one of the problems with post-traumatic stress disorder is when the targets are gone, when all of the motives are gone, when all of the mission is gone, and the comrades are not there with them anymore, and they're back home, and their mind is still playing that scene of, I just took a life, or my buddy was just killed right there beside me. And all of that floods in. But there's no mission to push it out. There's no mission that says you got to keep going and all of this. And so now it all comes back. And there they deal with the trauma all over again. Now, when the accident or the death of a person is traumatic, now let me suggest this, yes, almost every time there's a degree of trauma in it, because this is a change of life that we don't like, losing a loved one and so forth. But certain circumstances, an automobile accident where someone goes off to work and the next day they're driving in their job, and suddenly there's a call comes home, but your loved one never makes it home. It's the traumatic experience that says he was doing this and an accident happened and it's all done and it's over and you'll never see him again and you'll never say goodbye to him. Those are all parts of a traumatic death, a traumatic situation, traumatic grief. Now, with that, one of the problems that we see with that trauma, what makes it the grieving process complicated? Well, what happens with the grieving process is that I have to separate the two emotions now, the trauma and the grief. Both of them are emotions. Now let me share just another thought about this trauma and grief, okay? One of the concepts then of the trauma concept is the whole idea is that when the individual gets this message, all these feelings of shock and denial and want to work through it and all of this, they immediately go into action and they think they've got it beaten. When they finally come down, okay, I'm ready for this, ready for that. And that's again one of the problems of dealing with that psycho thought or stages thought. We never know really when we're ready for and all of this. And so with that trauma, let's look at another way. Let's say the trauma is a case where remember the whole idea is it's traumatic, but I shut down on the trauma part and I just keep going. What if the traumatic experience happens when you lost a loved one in an auto accident? Well, someone has to take charge. And so someone gets in charge of things and so forth, and they don't let their emotions out. They don't let you see what they're feeling by way of grief because they want to be the strong person that helps make decisions, that helps guide individuals through what they need to be doing. And so with that, they put on this front. Now, one of the things that we said about grief is you need to let it out. You need to find ways to express it. You do not need to keep it buried inside. It will consume you. But here's this person who thinks he's doing well because he needs to be there for everybody else. But what he's doing, he's never dealing with the traumatic experience of the loss. He's just going on and on and on. And at a certain point, he has to come to the place where he recognizes the trauma of all of it. But now here's the real problem. I said you have to separate the emotions from the trauma and the emotions from the grief. Here's the problem with trauma. Here's the problem with people going through PTSD and so forth. One of the struggles with all of this is that when you start to accent the problem, when you start to talk about what really happened, then all of those first emotions that you successfully, quote unquote, successfully buried come to the surface. And most people don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it because those emotions are so strong and so powerful, and the pain of it becomes so great that it's worse, maybe. Well, that you can't even say. You can't say for sure because it's different for everyone. But it's almost as bad as the grief that says things will be forever different. The way it happened. I buried it successfully, I thought, but now it's still there, underlying. And so if I'm going to help the person go through the grief, they're also going to need to find help with the trauma. Now, I need to share this with you. If you're going through a case like this, you may need professional help. Because one of the problems with dealing with the traumatic experience of this, the individual can be pushed over the edge. So you need to get that professional help from someone who knows what they're doing and knows how to work with a person and let them share at their own ability to share. I know I was talking with a patient in the hospital one day. And for some reason or other, he decided to let go of a traumatic experience and share it with me. But then what was interesting is, all of a sudden, as he shared this portion, I don't want to talk about that anymore. And so he talked about his condition, his circumstance, and different things. And I was not about to go back and try to dig for more. Because he had decided, no more, I don't want to talk about it anymore. And that's the thing that you need to have your professional help with. At what point do we tell them, well, I need to ask you this question, or I need to ask you that? Okay, we don't want to push them over the edge, and so you might need some professional help, but it surely complicates the grieving process because you've got two different emotions, one working against the other, and it can destroy us physically, emotionally, and so forth. So let's look at the idea that trauma does complicate the grieving process. Something else. When the loss of the grieving person is forever different. Now, we mentioned this earlier, but when we look at the idea that everything is now different, but wait a minute, the person is now different. One of the things we notice about relationships is we are shaped by relationships. That is, the way people treat me and the way I respond to that treatment will determine my personality, my values, my views, and so forth. Negative habits come from treating other people's actions in a negative way, and positive at the same way. But it's how I treat that person that helps shape my life. And in reality, we can say then, everybody in my life, to one degree or another, will shape me. The way I see things, the way I respond to things, they will shape me. Now, I get to choose how they're going to shape me. That's true. I get to choose whether they're going to make me bitter or they're going to make me better, but they will shape me. Now, how does this complicate grief? Well, what you've got to realize, and a lot of people don't realize, they look at the idea, yes, things are going to be forever different, but they fail to realize that I'm going to be forever different. This person shaped my life. Excuse me. This person basically became part of me, in essence of the way they treated me and the way I learned to respond to that. And nobody else will treat me in the same way. And so I'm going to be a little bit different. My personality changes. Now, when we look at all of these other things and we see how these person's going to be forever different, we look at all of these other complications that comes to the feeling of grief. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that now that I'm forever different, I don't trust anymore. Worked with an individual some time ago that lost loved ones in an accident, okay? And it was supposed to be a pleasant trip and all of this, and everybody was going to come home, and everything was going to be great, but it didn't happen that way. And it's kind of interesting. Remember the idea of how this grief lasts? Okay? It's something you have to work through, and you will never get to the end of it. You're always dealing with something that'll be forever different. Well, sometime later, after we had worked with this person for some time, later they had come to the place where they wanted to plan a trip, and suddenly were afraid to plan the trip. Because all of the thoughts of the past, like this one went on a trip, but they never made it home. What's going to happen with me? Can I make the trip? Can I even plan a trip? Will something happen in between time? Now, this is the element of trust, right? You see, when a trust is broken, we have to go back and learn how to trust all over again. Okay, trust is part of the personality, and Erik Erikson developed the life cycle theory, and what he talked about was the idea when a trust is broken, you have to go back and learn how to trust all over again. When someone breaks my trust, it's not just a matter of them learning to be better and more trustworthy, but it's a matter of me learning how to trust. And so with it then, what happens, we trusted this person, this family, and all of these people were doing this and that and so forth, and they came back home. Can I trust that it'll happen again? They didn't come back home this time. Okay? Can I trust things that we did normally? Okay? Maybe activities, maybe sports activities, and we lost a loved one or something in one of those activities. Well, I'm going to give it up. Can I trust? Many times this happens with motorcycle activities and so forth, and whoops, no more motorcycle. And that's fine if that's the decision, that's your way of dealing with the grief. But the idea of what makes it complicated also is I've got to learn to be able to trust so I can keep doing things because I am forever different. You may not want to go back to motorcycles and so forth, but there are certain parts of life that are things that you have to do, and sometimes you have to force yourself to do them, and the reason you're doing that is to rebuild the trust. Okay, I'm going to try it again, and that's one of the ways you deal with this. Keep trying that experience under safe circumstance. So, okay, it worked out this time. Now we'll try it another time and so forth. And so eventually it comes back to you. But again, that's part of the grief cycle when you've had a loss in relationship to a particular circumstance. And you are different because you don't trust anymore. And you have to learn how to retrust. Okay? Again, one of the things in this is the strain on relationships. Okay, one of the problems that complicates the grieving is while the person's forever different, then while we look at that, some of the facts we got to realize our relationship to others is different, and so that complicates it too. Maybe someone doesn't like the quote-unquote new me, and I've got to deal with that. I've got to deal with that because I'm now different. Okay, and the lack of trust or the lack of the concept of blaming and all of this, becoming negative. We've got to learn to deal with that because it will complicate the grieving process because it complicates other relationships. And it complicates my own relationship. I was talking with an individual one time and they shared how they were becoming so very angry and didn't like what they were doing and it was taking out on others. But the bottom line with all of this is they were now different. And when you look at the concept, dealing with the subject of grief and the anger part of that grief, yes, they were changing, they were different, and they didn't like it. And part of getting back to the strength that you had once before in dealing with the grief is dealing with that new person that you don't like, that new person you're becoming. And so it's there. You may need help with it. You may need some anger management. You may need to find ways to experience and experiment to rebuild the trust. But again, that's part of the complicated grief. So if you find yourself doing that, it's not necessarily, oh, there's something wrong with me, but you've got a cause for it. Now I label the cause. Now how can I deal with it? And I have to rebuild my ability to trust. I have to re-deal with my feelings of anger so that I vent them in a more positive way and I don't take them out against the wrong person. Now we've got another segment here dealing with the subject of anger, so I challenge you to go ahead and tune in on this YouTube to the section dealing with the subject of anger and anger management. It can help you very much on this area. Well, another thing is the way people deal with their loss. Some people want to keep it inside. That definitely complicates it. Okay, I don't want to talk about it. Nobody wants to hear about it. And when I want to talk about it, it gets worse and worse and so forth. So I don't want to talk about it. I just bury it. But it doesn't go away. And so this is a negative way and causes grief to be complicated. I ran into an individual once that something happened years ago in their childhood. And they were not able, because of their childhood, the adults around didn't let them express it, didn't walk them through it and so forth. And back in those days, it was something that happened, forget it, go on. As a child especially, and this is why it's so important we have a segment dealing with the idea of helping children grieve. You need to work with children so we don't bury it in the past. But many times this is what happens with the way a person deals with the loss. Now many years later, they find themselves dealing with the loss of friends, relatives, loved ones in a more difficult way. And when they talk with them, they related this experience of their childhood, and I'm saying yes, it could very well make the difference in the way you're dealing with the grief today. It complicates the grieving process. So with it, you need to challenge yourself in the sense of how you're going to deal with this loss. You need to talk about it. You need to share it with others. You need to be part of a grief support group or part of in the family. In some cases, I recommended families have times where they get together and pull out the family album and we talk about this and this and this. We don't want to close it up. We don't want to put them behind. We don't want to forget them. And so we're not just going to bury the pictures and all of that. We want to take the time to talk about them and to work through this, because it can be complicated if we don't work through it. Okay, how about the world of magical thought? Now, I've often related this to children, okay, but it can happen to people of all ages. The concept of the world of magical thought with the child, for instance, they will say, they get angry at someone and they will say to them, I hate you and I hope you go away and never come back. And then suddenly something happens to that person and they die. Now the child remembers what they said. It was an act out of emotions. The emotions were very strong, so they remember the emotions. They remember every word they said. And now when they reflect upon it, when they share upon it and so forth, now they're remembering that person is never going to come back. They did exactly what I told them. Go away and never come back, so it's absolutely my fault. Guilt is very much a part of the grieving process, and magical thought will cause children to hold on to the guilt. Will cause children to believe that all of it's their fault because they can't disconnect between the thing that they said and what happened. And now I say this happens with all ages. It's mentioned so strongly with regards to dealing with children, but the fact is it's there for adults too. Words that were said, arguments that were made. How many individuals had an argument with a person just before they died, and now they want to feel that they did something wrong? Now they want to feel that they caused this death. It was their wish, their will. They wanted them out of their sight and so forth, and now they caused it all. It complicates grief. Now what can I do about that? Well, there's a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to that. And the only thing I can say, when a person asks questions for which there's no answer, they basically just want to talk about that. This may come up again here. But when they ask questions for which there's no answer, the idea is, well, what do you think? Don't try to give them answers, because if you try to give them answers, then you betray yourself. You can't give the right answer. Okay, so you let them come up with the answer. Well, I don't really know what the answer is to that right now. Can you tell me what you think? How do you feel about it? And let them share their feelings. Now, if you can guide them with their feelings so that they can better help themselves, that will be of advantage. But it's something they have to come to themselves. You can tell them all night, well, it's not your fault. You couldn't control the circumstance and all that. But in this world of magical thought, that doesn't cut it. Okay? They have to come to the conclusion themselves. That's why it's important for you to ask them, well, what do you think? How do you feel about this? What would you do to change that? Is there any way you had control over that? Now, if they can come to the conclusion themselves, then maybe they can decide, okay, it's not my fault. Okay, it's just a circumstance that I had no control over, so I can't blame myself when it's not my fault. But again, it's a very ticklish situation where they have to come to the conclusion. This is where in grief counseling you need to be very careful about instructing and telling people what to do. Again, the most important part is that they come to the conclusion themselves. I had an incident one day when I was talking with an individual, just plain counseling. I think the subject was depression. And they were talking on and on and on, and I want to interrupt, yeah, but this, and so forth, but I didn't. I was biting my tongue, as it were, keeping it out and so forth, and then the person finally says, well, I guess that's what you want me to say, huh? And really, the advantage was when they said it, I knew they got the message. It wasn't me telling them and wondering if they got the message. They said it. They told it back to me, and they came to the conclusion themselves. And with that, I know they arrived at the right conclusion. And that's what you need to do with magical thought. Entertain their thoughts. Ask them some questions that make them rethink the situation. And in so doing, help them discover for themselves, really, it's not my fault. Magical thought has a lot to do with the guilt process, and that's very much a part of grief, the guilt process. And so with that, then, you're going to help them much if you let them come to the conclusion themselves. Again, one of the problems with complicated grief, you might just need, and maybe the most important part is that you recognize when you need to get professional help. This might not be something that you could handle on your own. Might be something totally strange to you, and you need to be careful. If you need to get someone to get help, maybe you want to do that. Look up a list of things and so forth, a list of persons, counselors and so forth, and find help for the person. But on the other hand, realize it's part of complicated grief. Nothing necessarily wrong, it's just the way the grief has touched them and the way they made it complicated by their reaction to it. Let's look at another one, when the grieving person and the caregiver fail to understand the relationship. I mentioned that early, but let me dwell upon that a moment or so. When the relationship isn't clearly understood. And with that, we're looking at the idea of, a 5-year-old child loses his grandfather. And so we think, well, that's normal, that's natural, because we bury our grandparents and all of this. But wait a minute, the question I need to ask is, what was the relationship between the child and the grandparent? Now, the irony of that is, you can't really analyze that. You might think that they were very distant in all of this, but you don't know what was going on in the child's mind in relationship to that parent, or that grandparent. On the other hand, what happens if that grandparent was one who took the child to school and picked them up after school, because mom and dad were both working? What if this grandparent was there at every baseball game cheering him on? What if this grandparent was someone he would go to and talk to when everybody else was too busy to listen? You see a relationship now? Now, all of these things were going to be now missing in the child's life, and this is the way his life will be forever different. He's got to find somebody new to talk to, and maybe he won't be able to find somebody new. And especially if we come walking in and instructing him, well, you shouldn't feel this way. I mean, after all, that's what grandparents do and so forth. Then you're automatically shutting the door to suggest that you won't understand when I'm ready to talk to you. You don't understand what I'm feeling, so I can't share my feelings with you. Especially so if we say, well, you should get over it. Oh, man, that's one of the worst things I've ever heard said to someone going through grief. You should be over it by now. No, grief takes a lifetime. And if you don't understand the relationship, can I help you with that? Excuse me. Can I help you with that? If you can possibly first try to understand the relationship. Try to figure out what the person is feeling with regards to the closeness and the relationship. And again, with all of that, understand the fact that you still don't understand. If you're not there, you still don't grasp it. But try to understand that there is something there that you don't know about and you can't deal with, so you don't need to impose it upon the person. So whatever the relationship, know what it is. Understand it before you pass any kind of a judgment. And I'm sorry, but I've already told you, you do not pass judgment when it comes to grief, because everybody's grief is different. I cannot judge you for my grief. Even if I went through a very similar circumstance, I can't judge you. You need to go through that yourself. And you, if you're going to help them, need to be the listener that lets them go through it the way they want to go through it. When friends and family refuse to understand the grieving process, that's another complication. Excuse me, please. What happens with this is many times people got their whole idea of how they want to grieve and how it should be done. Excuse me, I got a tickle in my throat here. And so with it, they want you to fit into their concept. And so they want to instruct you. Oh, you shouldn't be doing that. Oh, you better not do that. And yes, there are certain guidelines to the grieving process. But again, you don't impose those guidelines. Unless the person is going to be hurting themselves or hurting someone else, then you need to step in. Then you need to talk about it. Okay? If they're going to make a decision that, again, the whole picture is it's not going to be a good decision. This is not the time to make decisions. Then you might want to intervene. This is one of the big things about the grieving process that complicates it. That's when people try to make decisions that they shouldn't now because their ability to think clearly is clouded by the grief emotions, by the pain of the grief and so forth. And again, the ability to trust and mistrust and all of this is in there because of what just happened, and now I got to make a decision. Let me throw that out there. Again, making major decisions when you're going through grief, you should wait. You should wait on that. So you got a clear picture of what all is happening there and so forth. And so with the whole idea is if you don't understand the grieving process and the need to wait for decisions, the need to feel, okay, what I'm doing is okay, this pain that I feel is okay, there's nothing wrong with me, and if someone else is there to coach you and to help you, and again, it's not so much about the coaching, it's about the affirming. Let me put it that way. The best you can do to help someone else in the grieving process is to affirm. When they tell you what's going on and so forth and how they're feeling, well, that's okay. It's normal to feel that way with what you're going through. It's all right to feel that way. It's part of the grieving process. That's compared to, well, you shouldn't feel that way, or, well, have you tried this, or would you want to do this? No. What you need most is to be the listener. I told you that before. Listen to them, let them share, and then affirm. The why question is another thing that complicates grief. With the why question, what we're dealing with here is there's many times when there is no answer. Excuse me. There's no answer to the why question. Okay? And so if there's no answer, don't try to give the answer. Why is a judgment question? Okay, it's the idea of I don't have facts, I just got to guess why. And a judgment question, you can't answer. And so again, with our thoughts and our thinking, our emotions complicated with grief, you can't come up with the answers to why questions. So the question I've got then is, why do people ask why questions when they know there's no answer? Well, the basic thought there is they want to talk about it. So if someone comes up to you with a why question, you need to tell them, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. What do you think the answer is? What would you tell me, or what would you tell someone else if they asked you that question? And that way, they're at least getting a chance to talk about it. We don't just bury it by saying, well, there is no answer, so don't bother asking those questions. No, let them ask the question, but let them tell you what they're thinking. That's a very important part of it. Let them tell you what they're thinking and get that out, because it's another way to talk about my grief. It's another way to get that particular feeling out. Whatever produced the why question, get that out by letting them talk about it. Another thing is the understanding of depression. Depression is very much a part of the grieving process. Now, we have done another segment on overcoming depression. And if you've got a struggle in this area, I challenge you to go to the YouTube that deals with that subject, because it's very important that we understand depression. Okay, depression is from two different aspects of depression. There is primary depression and secondary depression. Primary depression is things like bipolar, moving from one swing to the other. Okay, one day it used to be called manic depressive, with the whole idea one time there's mania, all kinds of excitement and so forth. Another time there is depression and I don't feel like doing anything. And so with this, then it's like, yeah, the mood swings are there. That requires generally medical help. It's the chemical flow in the brain. But now all depression, to one degree or another, affects the chemical flow in the brain, or is affected by the chemical flow in the brain. Now, there's another primary depression, and that's unipolar, and that's where someone goes under periods of depression for long periods of time, and maybe come out for a week or two, a year or whatever, but then maybe again going back for long periods of time. Now, let me talk about a secondary depression. Okay, that's primary depression we've talked about, and both of those usually require medical help. And so you stay in touch with your doctors. Don't play with the medications. Work through it with your doctors. But now there's a secondary medication, and it's really what the word secondary suggests. Secondary depression. Something causes the depression, and grief causes depression. Stress causes depression. And so when the grief hits us, there is a period of depression. Now, in order to deal with that depression, now again, I challenge you, if you want to talk to doctors about medication, again, it affects the chemical flow of the brain, and the medication they give you is there to adjust the chemical flow. But I also want to remind you that, again, this is a normal part of the grieving process. So the medication may not be necessary. I leave that between you and your doctor, okay? That's between you and your doctor. But with it, again, is if I'm anticipating and suggest there's going to be times of depression. Now, in this other segment that we dealt with the subject of depression, we gave 7 healthy things that I can do to overcome secondary depression. Now, we're not going to go through that now, but if you want to focus on that YouTube and that particular segment of our YouTube and check it out, it can be very helpful to you. You see, we're designing these thoughts on these YouTubes as to be interacting one with the other. So the hope is that you can get into any one of them and find help for whatever you're dealing with. So when it comes to the subject of depression and grief, what you need to realize is, okay, I need to deal with the grief process. And as I can get stronger and stronger with the grieving process, then I can overcome the depression process. It's very interesting how if we can deal with the thing that causes stress, the stress causes depression. So if I can deal with the thing in the person's life and help them overcome the stressor, then it'll also help them deal with the depression. If I can find ways to overcome and deal with grief, then I can deal with the depression. And again, with all of that, you need to realize that in dealing with these two, the whole picture is that it's going to take time. It's not something that'll go away, okay, I feel good today, and so it's already gone, but then all of a sudden a week later I feel depressed again. No, it's something you have to develop the pattern of finding ways to deal with your grief, which will also help you deal with your depression. Again, I've got to remind you that you need to turn to that segment on overcoming depression that we share with you and follow through with that. Again, our hope is that when we share all of these, and we got numerous topics, but when we share all of these, that you'd be able to interact with them, that is going from one to the other, and find the answers to what your needs are. Our whole goal of putting these YouTubes out there for the public is that we're no longer able to do the one-on-one for everybody. My health was wearing out too much, so this way we can put it out there so that anybody who can get onto YouTube can work with this and pass it back and forth as far as figuring out, okay, this is one way to deal with this thing, but now how should I deal with this, and so forth. So please let me encourage you to go back and forth with all of these topics and find the answers you need. We're doing our best to put them all there. Let's look at something else with regards to complicated grief, and that's the loss of a child. A lot of people don't realize, and again, it's so unnatural is what people say, and it's true. So unnatural for a parent to bury their child. But there's also another cause behind that. I mentioned Erik Erikson some time ago and his life psychotherapy and how he viewed personality development. And one of the things he points out is in latter life, And as a person begins to approach the senior years and so forth, they struggle with two different emotions, and that is stagnation or generativity. One or the other, generativity or stagnation. And now with that, generativity is the next generation. We take pride in the next generation. We take pride in the values we've taught them. We know our values are going to live on now because, well, we might pass from the scene, but they're carrying on the family name. They're carrying on the family tradition. They're carrying on the family values. But when we've lost a child, one of the problems that comes in that stage of life is the stagnation. What was my life worthwhile? I mean, how was it worthwhile? How did I... It's not going to be carried on. When I'm gone, it's gone. Now, can I suggest to you, and this is a very ticklish area, you have to know, they have to know when and how and so forth. But can I suggest to you one of the ways of helping someone that's lost their child? When they are ready, you don't just replace that child. But if you're pastoring a church or if you're working with these kind of people, if there's some way that you can involve them in a program where they'll touch the lives of others, if you can involve them in a program that maybe will help shape the lives of teenagers, of youth, and so forth, then in the end of their life, maybe a Sunday school class that they would teach. Now again, they're going to have to know when they're ready for it. But if you're a caring pastor, a caring person that can work in this area, if you can find a way and watch them and listen to them. Really, it's about listening. When you can listen to them and watch them and see when they've got a desire to become involved in the lives of others. Then, when they come to that end of life, okay, my values will still go on. I taught this when I shared with that one. One of the things I find most exciting for teachers that have retired and are now up in years, and all of a sudden one of their students still remembers them. One of their students tells them, if you know of someone that is going through this grieving process and you know where some of the students are, or you might have been one of the students, go out of your way to remind them of the time when you were in their class. Try to accent something that they said or did that made a difference in your life, because this is very much a part of finding the healing process. Again, the healing process is not getting over the loss, but the healing process is learning to live with it. And if they can come to that end of life stage where they realize that my life did have meaning, it's not stagnant, it did have meaning, it touched the lives of others, please be cautious to help them find that, discover that, and so forth. And if you know that they've been through that and they're coming to you with their feelings, you might just want to direct them to think about, well, what about this person? You know, you made a difference in that person's life. And all of this. So again, it's a way to help them deal with the loss of the child, with the loss of the younger generation and so forth. How adversaries and holidays complicate grief. We're going to be sharing another segment on grief during the holidays. We've done this annually in seminars, and so we're going to be sharing another segment on that. So I don't want to go into it in details, but let me suggest this to you. Grief is about loss. And loss is an event where things will be forever different. Holidays are about memories. Anniversaries, holidays are all about memories. And now we're remembering the things that will never be the same. And that's what makes it complicated. When I was about ready to suggest I was through this, I was over this, then suddenly there comes this shocking reminder that Christmas won't be the same again. This shocking reminder that this is the anniversary, but we won't be celebrating it together anymore. Again, the things we used to do on the 4th of July. The family reunions we used to go to, but they won't be there with us anymore. These kind of events bring back memories stronger than ever before. And usually when you get into those situations, you have to come up with a lot of questions and answers and so forth. And people, well, what happened here? What happened there? And all of this. And you have to relive a lot of it. That can be healthy in some sense. But I haven't got the time to go into that in this segment. But please, when you see the other segment coming up there, look into the holiday grief, coping with grief during the holidays. And we're trying to share some ideas of some things we can do to help you through those holidays. Okay? Moving can bring complications too. Okay? I like to look at the grieving process, and I've said this before, but you've got this plate in front of you, and you keep putting more and more things on the plate. Individuals that have lost a loved one and decide that their answer is just to move out of the area and get rid of the memories, that is not a good idea. Because the moving, again, makes life forever different. And so whatever's different about the fact that their loved one's not there with them anymore, then the other difference is that it's not the same community. Moving away from friends that could be there to help us. Doing all of these things and trying to get rid of memories can make it even worse still, because you're getting rid of more than memories when you move out. One of the things that we've said before is an idea of making moves and things of this nature is it's something that you've got to come to the conclusion yourself as far as the grieving person. But those of you that are helping the grieving person need to realize that you don't tell them, oh, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, but you try to get them to think through it. You try to slow down the thinking process. And I knew of one particular situation when the person, nobody knew that they were doing it, and all of a sudden, boom, they're gone. They moved to a different town and all of this. And it was whenever we visited them there, it was not a case of being very happy there. And all of a sudden, I found out a few years later, boom, they moved to another town. And it's like, yes, making moves like that when you're going through the grieving process is not a wise thing, because what you're doing is not only making things forever different with your loss, but you've got another loss, because moving brings grief. So your plate is getting fuller and fuller. Let's look at something else there. Again, the idea of differences of opinion and so forth. Comparison. Maybe let's poke on this. Comparison. The idea of maybe a younger person dies and it's not fair. Or a person who's very good dies, and then you got this other person who has been a wicked person, at least in your judgment, and it's not fair. Okay, so we do a comparison that tries to help us justify, but usually we compare the good against the bad, and we think it's not fair, and so therefore we get another feeling of grief. Life just isn't fair anymore. What is fair? What is good? And what does my future hold? And all of this. It simply complicates the grieving process. Now, the one thing I've got to suggest concerning that is, yes, life is not fair, but it's not a case of grieving this against this. This is where faith and hope is so very important. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Read verses 13 through 18 of that chapter. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 18. And he suggests to them that they sorrow not as those that have no hope. Yes, there's a sorrow because we've lost a loved one. Things are going to be forever different. But we have a hope with it. And so when my loved one has been a good person, a godly person, doing everything to help others, and suddenly they're taken by death out of our life. Now, number one, you got to realize God didn't take them. Okay? The Bible doesn't say that God took them from us. Jesus said, I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. What happened was the accident or death or sickness or whatever took my loved one, but Jesus has received them into his presence. He's caring for them. They have entered into the joy of their Lord. They're now experiencing something that is so glorious that they do not want to come back to this world. So when we look at it that way, who then weighs fairness? Again, they've got their reward. They've got what they were working for because God is caring for them, and they're in that eternal hope. And then what that passage says in 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 13 through 18, what that tells us is our hope is one day we'll be together with them in the clouds. And so shall we ever be with the Lord and be with them. Comfort one another with these words is the way that text ends, with the realization that here is comfort in our hope. So comparing of why this and maybe this one shouldn't have and maybe that one. No, that's not our call. We can't always determine that. But with it all, we've got to picture that God knows what he's doing as far as comfort and care for. Okay? So something happened in my world that took my loved one, but God knows and God cares for. And one day God's going to take me home too. One day I'm going to rejoice. And when I get up there, I try to imagine my father and mother in heaven looking down upon us and saying, wait till you see what's waiting for you. The Bible says that precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. God doesn't look at death the same way we do, because he's looking at the idea that I've got something to give to you. I've got something you've been working for. The Bible tells us to send down treasures up into heaven and so forth. So I've got something that I've got to share with you. I want you to see what we've done with what you sent. And with all of this, and that's those acts of kindness. When, oh, this person was so good, why are they taken from me? Their acts of kindness went on before them, and they're enjoying the reward for it. So again, don't try to compare one against the other. Why this one and not that one? Again, there's no answers for it. There's no answers for it. Yes, you want to focus on the good deeds that they did in this life, but don't try to compare it to the fact that they're not here anymore. We're the ones that feel the hurt and the pain. Many times when loved ones are going through lengthy sicknesses, I get this message that the parent says, oh, if I could only, or the child or whoever says, if I could only take some of that pain. Well, in the grieving process, we take the pain, but they're no longer suffering. In the presence of their God, that's their hope, that's what they live for, and that's what they are now enjoying. And that's what I need to comfort, to strengthen. That's awesomely a part of the grieving process, to find that strength. And I say, one of the greatest things that you can give to your legacy that you can give to your family is to let them know where you're going, into the rewards of heaven. So again, it's very much a part. When you take the time to compare why that one and not this one, it complicates the grieving process. Don't complicate it by making comparison. If you want to make a comparison to what they're enjoying now as to what we're going through here. They're better off. They're better off than I am, and so forth. Let's look at anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is the grief that when we know we're going to die. And there's several complications there. Number one is death doesn't always happen the way we anticipated. And again, the whole picture is we thought this and this and this was going to happen, and boom, it didn't happen. It was all this different, and it confuses us. Again, sometimes when the illness brings a regression, and okay, we're grasping onto another hope, and we thought, well, they were going to get better, and then they went back to the sickness again and passed on. Okay, so anticipatory grief can be a problem and can cause more problems. One of the things with anticipatory grief is usually the dying person wants to talk about their problem. But sometimes the parents or I'm sorry, I shouldn't use the word parents. If it's a child, yes, the parents, but the loved ones, that's the word I want. The loved ones say, well, I don't want to talk about death. That's giving up, and we're not giving up and all this. But what you've got is a dying person wants to share, and they need someone to listen. And so with that, then, we need to have someone to let them share. And this becomes a problem, too, in anticipatory grief. Someone wants to share, but they can't share. And what we shut the door on when we don't let them share. Because afterwards, there's many things that we could talk about when they passed that they have shared with us. Many things that we could find for hope that they have shared with us. But we wouldn't let them talk about it. We wouldn't let anybody talk about it. Indeed, you need to find someone that be willing to listen to that person going through their dying process. Another thing about anticipatory grief that makes it so difficult is the family plans. Yes, we're making plans to go on vacation. We go every summer and so forth, but I'm not going to be alive this summer. I won't be there to enjoy it with you. Go ahead, enjoy, and I hope you have as much fun as before, but I won't be there with you. Now they're feeling the grief of the things that won't happen. The things that won't be the same. Every summer we did this, but I won't be at the reunion this year. I won't be doing this year. Okay? Those planned events, no, I won't be there for that. And it's grief. It's a grieving process. And it makes it difficult, and it makes it difficult for all around because we want to make the plans for the activity there, but this person's quite decided they're not going to be there. So how do I talk about the plans of the activity and enjoy the idea? Because much of a vacation is looking forward to it. That's what really makes a difference. But we don't dare talk about it because this person is not going to be there. And we don't want to make them feel bad. So anticipatory grief is very difficult, and that comes when an individual is idea that they know they're dying. Palliative care, they know they're dying, but again, nobody wants to talk about it, or they don't want to talk about plans and so forth, or nobody else wants to talk about the plans as if he or she is not going to be there. And it makes it difficult. It is difficult. Grieving is difficult, period. But when I share these complicated things of grief, I just want to share with you, you need to allow for the complications to work them through the process. You need to allow for the fact that, okay, it's okay to feel that way. It's okay to struggle with those thoughts. There's nothing wrong with you because you've got this extra negative thought or this difficult thing you're battling with. But again, the best thing you can do is to help these person is to be the listener. Let them tell you what they're thinking. Anticipatory grief, let them tell you what they're thinking about their death. Let them tell you what they're thinking about the future going on without them. Let them share all of those things. I was told of an individual once that was facing Alzheimer's, and they had an anticipatory grief in relation to that. And they said to one of the family members, my real concern is when I don't remember you people. And I thought that the response that this person made to them was so awesome. But we'll never forget you. Again, the whole picture is let them share that feeling. Don't say, oh, don't feel that way. Don't think that way. Let them think. Let them share it. Let it come out so that you can guide them in the way that they deal with it. Not instruct them, but guide them by asking them more questions. Asking them, well, how do you feel about this? And what is your thoughts on that? And so forth. Because if they put it in question form, even if there's no answer, they want to talk about it. So let them talk about it. The best thing you can do to help anyone in normal grief, in an anticipatory grief, in complicated grief, the best thing you can do is be the listener. Grief is a journey, and the only way you're going to help is to journey with them. I thank you so much for sharing these moments with us, and I hope they've been of some help to you. And again, I want to challenge you to go and look at some of these other topics on this YouTube system, and we want to find ways that you can put this together for yourself and find help to deal with your situation. Goodbye now.